The commonest cause of death is heart attacks and strokes. The problem is not fat, the problem is not cholesterol, the problem is elevated sugar. While an apple may be okay for other people, for me, it's a trigger.
Dr. Robert Cywes,
a double board certified surgeon and a world-renowned expert in metabolic disease.
He's on a mission to fix your heart and your brain from disease.
And expose the truth about statins.
By the time you're sitting in the emergency room clutching your chest because you've had a heart attack or your face is drooping because you've had a stroke, it's too late. Doctors should be appropriately worried about your heart attack and stroke risk. The problem is they associate elevated LDL, elevated cholesterol with that risk, and that's a false association. Every single cell in your body is made of 2 layers of fat. And if you're on a low-fat diet, you're depriving your cells of healthy forms of fat.
Let's talk about statins, the risks of statins.
The statins cross into the brain. The brain is about 2% of the human body, and yet it uses 20% of the body's cholesterol. Well, if you block that, how's your brain supposed to work? How's your brain supposed to repair itself? The narrative in our community is protein, 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 and that's an error because...
Let's talk about fat. Let's dive deep into fat. Does saturated fat in any way destroy the heart?
Well, okay, so let's go back a step because I think there's a misconception a little bit about saturated fat. If I told you this one thing was causing those 3 highly likely causes of your death, what's the obvious answer? Stay away from the harmful thing. What really matters is what is your personal risk of a heart attack or a stroke. There's a very simple test, a screening test that we can get for that.
We have been told that cholesterol and LDL is the cause of heart attacks and strokes. But my guest today, Dr. Rob Cywes, will share evidence as to why this is not correct and show the true cause of heart attacks and strokes, and a very simple test that we can all get that can actually prevent both. But before we start, I have a favor to ask. If you are learning from and enjoying these episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast, because it is our mission to share that the food that we eat, our diet, can fix the most chronic health conditions that not even big food and big pharma can help us with. And by subscribing, you can share this message to millions more people that need to hear it. And hopefully, it can save their life. Thank you. Dr. Cywes, welcome.
Thank you very much, Rena. It's good to be here.
As a double board certified surgeon, one of the things that annoys you the most is this demonization of saturated fat and the inappropriate existence of statins to prevent heart disease. And these 2 recommendations have largely caused the increase in deaths from cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes. So today, Dr. Cywes is going to share his 20 years of experience and talk about the true cause of heart attacks, why ketosis and cholesterol is useless, and why a high-fat diet will actually protect your heart. So Dr. Cywes, my first question. People don't want to have a heart attack. So what is the number 1 cause of plaque in the arteries that can lead to a heart attack?
Well, first of all, Rena, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be talking with you and getting the word out there. The commonest cause of death, certainly in the United States, is, and in most first world type countries, is heart attacks and strokes. So it is a quintessential thing that we have to focus on. And yet in large part, it has been ignored as a preventive or a screening test that we do. Every woman is going to get a mammogram. Men are going to get their prostates looked at. Colons are going to be looked at. But we don't screen for cardiovascular disease. It's kind of upside down. And there are great screening tools to detect early development of cardiovascular disease in younger people. I start to screen at around 40 years of age, and already that's probably a little bit old, but that's the earliest that we start to screen. So I think it's important to understand that if you don't know, you don't know. And by the time you're sitting in the emergency room clutching your chest because you've had a heart attack or your face is drooping because you've had a stroke, it's too late. That event has occurred, and there are plenty of ways earlier and earlier that we can divert away from that with recognition. That's the first thing. The second thing is that not everybody is vulnerable to heart attacks and strokes. If you think about this and you ask me what causes it, well, the starting point, the initiating concern that we had in the world in the 1950s and 60s was a massive rise in heart attack and stroke deaths, but it was directly, we now know retrospectively, it was directly related to nicotine. And yet, many countries still allow vaping and that kind of thing because the tobacco companies, oh, it's fine. So The starting pivotal point was nicotine, and it's important to understand that because industry vociferously defended their profit-making when they sold tobacco products and diverted our attention away from nicotine being the causative agent that created the plaque in our blood vessels toward what the plaque was made of. And, in other words, if your house is on fire, instead of worrying about the fire, you're saying, oh my God, these fire engines outside are making all this noise. Look at the racket. Please, can the fire engines go away? Call the police to get rid of the fire engines. That's lunacy. If your house is on fire, you want as many fire engines out there, but at the same time, you don't want your house to be on fire. And if we can prevent the fire, then we don't need the fire engines. So the fire engines is your body's response to inflammation or to injury. And the body has, over thousands of years, developed a very robust attack and defense mechanism against injury. You cut yourself, you bleed a little bit, the clot forms, a scab forms, and then your skin heals up. Well, the whole body functions that way, or the majority of the body functions that way, and your blood vessels are no different. The issue is that your blood vessels should not be having that degree of injury. And I mean, if you think about walking out in the woods and you get stuck in a bunch of brambles and you get cuts all over your body, that's what nicotine does to your blood vessels. And when we blamed the fat response, and I'll explain that in a second, that part of the healing response that the body has when there's inflammation is to form a little clot, just like you do when you cut your arm. The clot then gets populated with cells, white cells, immune cells, and those immune cells then attract a layer that basically smooths that injury over. And the macrophages have receptors, I'm going to go a little nerdy here, called ApoB receptors that attract. Think of that ApoB as a zip code. It's the zip code of your house or your postal code. And there are molecules or little structures that float around in your blood vessels that have other purposes, but they also have this little zip code. And part of the response is the final response to inflammation, where the LDL molecule, the one that everybody's concerned about, LDL, that's got a zip code that attaches to the macrophages that dumps some fat and cholesterol to smooth over the injury. But it's not causing the problem. It's responding to the problem. And without that, two major concerns. Number one, you're not adequately healing the injury. And number two is if you decrease your LDL, it's not doing its other normal functions. The functions in the vessels is not its primary function. That's a backup. That's the backup function. For example, in the US, fire trucks are out there to put fires out, but the overwhelming response they have is to injury, to car wrecks and that kind of thing. So same thing with LDL. LDL is a delivery system for fuel, for energy, for structural elements to the cells of your body, all of whom need fat. And the inflammatory response is just part of the job that they do. And to blame the LDL for responding to an injury, because that's what we see. We see the plaque, we see the fire trucks. It doesn't make logical sense at all. And then on top of that, the medications that they use to decrease that inflammation, or not to decrease the inflammation, sorry, I misspoke, to decrease the LDL, are very, very toxic to other parts of the human system where LDL would be performing other functions. So to simplify that, the issue here is inflammation, and inflammation started out being caused by nicotine. But when you examine the people that have heart attacks and strokes under the microscope, when you examine their blood vessels under the microscope, and as a surgeon, I've held that stuff in my hand. It's this gelatinous, I know it's early morning for me, it's snot-like stuff that it just crumbles in your hand, but it's made of cholesterol and fat. So if you look at it under the microscope, it is cholesterol and fat. So the tobacco companies then, with a few skeptical or doctors that weren't quite as ethical as they should be, said, oh, it's the fat that's accumulating in your blood vessels that is causing the problem. And that's false. So as soon as we diverted and we blamed the fat, we forgot about inflammation. And so then we said, okay, let's block this fat, because remember, the statin industry began in response to smoking plaque, not necessarily in response to carbohydrate plaque, because the statins were developed in the 70s and really the 80s and 90s. At a time we started seeing an increased heart attack and stroke risk, smoking was declining, And we started to see the other very injurious agent, which is elevated levels of blood sugar. As the sugar manufacturing industry came up, together with that, they started to produce some statins. But the statins occurred prior to the era of carbohydrate injury of the blood vessels. So they were really addressing the plaque, and they've now morphed that across. But the two injurious agents are nicotine, elevated levels of nicotine, and elevated levels of blood sugar. And it's important to understand that because there are two populations when it comes to injury from, well, let's look at nicotine. Some people who smoke get heart attacks and strokes. Some people who smoke get lung disease, emphysema, and lung cancer. That is genetically predetermined. The cause is nicotine, but whether you get lung disease or heart disease is genetically predetermined. Exactly the same thing in the blood vessels, and most physicians don't even understand this. There are people like myself who genetically, our bodies are very, very good, very effective at clearing the sugar from the bloodstream, so we don't live in this high blood sugar environment. I used to eat a lot of sugar, but my body shoved that into my cells. My cells converted to fat. And the production of fat by the human body, by the liver and the fat cells, protects you from that injury in the blood vessels. Now, there are other diseases associated with that, but then there are other people who cannot produce enough, and the hormone that does that is insulin. So when you cannot produce enough insulin, now you can't get that sugar out of the blood vessels adequately, and therefore your blood sugar rises. And it's that chronically elevated blood sugar that your body can't utilize sitting in the blood vessels that creates the inflammation. And I've proven in the laboratory when I did my PhD that we can create that inflammation within 3 hours, where you get an immune response. So it's a very rapid response. So if you think about it, your blood sugars are elevated, even mildly elevated, where most are, oh, it's a little high, drink less Coke. That injury is a chronic injury that continues to occur. And we're starting to see kids in their teens, in their early 20s with type 2 diabetes. And the interesting thing is everybody, when they look at children, look at the obese child and say, oh my God, they're so sick. They're actually a lot healthier than the skinny kid who is eating the same amount of sugar and starch, because they are developing the vascular injury. And that is a big concern for us. And we're seeing it earlier and earlier and earlier. That's why we should be screening earlier. So the problem is not fat. The problem is not cholesterol. The problem is elevated sugar. But we divert and we blame the sugar, and at least we blame the fat instead of the sugar. And I think the important consideration here is that narrative is driven by industry. The smoking folks, now they say, oh, smoking's bad, but vaping is fine because it doesn't have smoke in it. Well, who are you going to trust? And same thing with sugar. Oh, it's natural sugar. It's healthy for you. There is very, very few sources of sugar that we currently eat that existed in their current form when I was born. Think that one through, okay? A lot of the majority of the food we eat currently did not exist in the 1950s and 60s. So it's not natural. It's all manufactured and hybridized. So, when we're eating food that's supposed to be so healthy for us, those are people who believe that we started to exist. Adam and Eve are 50 years old or 60 years old. Doesn't work that way.
As you can hear from Dr. Cywes, one of the biggest causes of heart attacks and strokes is sugar. And so we need to avoid it. And we also need to rebuild our body from the inside out. And later on, Dr. Cywes will talk more about the foods that we need to eat and those that we need to avoid. But the thing is, the way that our food is produced with pesticides and toxins, this can limit the absorption of nutrients into the mitochondria of your cells. And that's why I have Armour Colostrum as a sponsor of today's video. Now, you might have heard of colostrum. It is a milky fluid that is released by mammals, including humans, in the first 48 to 72 hours after birth. And Armour Colostrum is packed full of nutrients, including over 400 functional nutrients like peptides, antibodies, and antioxidants to help support your cells, gut function and immune system, and so much more. Now, I use 3 to 4 full scoops of Armour Colostrum per day in chilled water, and I have noticed benefits in my skin and also my hair, because colostrum contains growth factors that can help stimulate collagen production and also skin elasticity. So if you'd like to try Armour Colostrum, just head to tryarmour.com/5minute body or use code 5minute body to get 15% off your first order. So the first two is the nicotine, which is smoking. I think many people know that they shouldn't smoke, they shouldn't vape. Even alcohol, don't drink the alcohol. The next one you mentioned is chronic high blood sugar levels. Let's go to the next two, which is high blood pressure.
So there are three, when I look at the heart in terms of acquired metabolic disease, there are three categories that we look at. The first one is the plaque, which is an inflammatory response of the cells, the endothelium, that line the blood vessels. And what happens with those cells is they should be quiescent. When you look under the microscope at healthy endothelium, it looks like a fried egg. They've got a nucleus, which is the yolk, and it should look like a flat fried egg. But that flat molecule is not a stable state. The stable state for any cell is a round or oval cell. It should look like a real egg, an egg that's just been laid. And there are, it's called the cytoskeleton. They're little skeletal things, just like the human body has a skeleton, that it's an active thing that hold it in that flat shape. But a flat molecule is really just a transition point. It's flat, so fluids and nutrition and everything else can get from the bloodstream across the endothelial cell into the cells of the organ that's being fed by that blood through what's called the interstitium. So that is an active form, a healthy form of a cell. When sugar comes along down that blood vessel, the first thing that sugar does is it goes into the cell. Now, every molecule of sugar has a molecule of glucose, has 6 molecules of water attached to it. So you get this instant flooding of extra water inside of the endothelial cell. And a flat thing doesn't hold a lot of water, so the cell rounds up and it becomes this big swollen cell full of water. And we've got a sodium glucose water exchange to get rid of that water. The problem is we're on a low salt diet, and salt is one of the more important things to consume, and yet everybody's told us don't consume salt because of the water. The problem is actually sugar, not salt. See how upside down it is. So now we've got these big swollen endothelial cells. That skeleton gets damaged, and the cells are now swollen, and when they swell, they bulge into the lumen, into the inside of the blood vessel. And under the influence of sugar, those cells are going from being nice and smooth like Teflon, where the blood just slides by, to being activated because they feel the injury. And that injury is now attracting clot. It's attracting and activating the intrinsic clotting cascade. So you get this cascade of clot. And for example, factor 4 of the clotting cascade is calcium. And the last layer is the layer on the lipids. As those endothelial cells swell, they narrow the lumen. And anybody that understands physics understands that it's radius to the power of 4. So any minor reduction in the radius of a blood vessel radically increases the pressure that is required to go across that blood vessel. So our blood pressure starts to go up. Now, we think of a blood pressure of 120/80 millimeters of mercury to be a normal blood pressure. It isn't. It's closer to 110/60, 110/70 that's normal. But we've accepted that higher pressure as normal because of that slight swelling of the endothelial cells. So hypertension is caused directly by sugar and the initial inflammation, but it's separate and apart from the plaque. The plaque occurs just in specific areas and different areas depending on the drug that's of the toxin that's initiating it. Nicotine more peripheral, some central, sugar primarily central. But the plaque disease is a plumbing problem. It's where the plumbing is getting clotted. The hypertension is a swelling and a narrowing problem, as well as a bit of inflammation. And then the third cardiovascular issue that we have. Remember I said earlier on, you've got your endothelial cells, then you've got a space called the interstitium, and then you've got your organ, whatever that organ is. So you've got to get nutrition across the cell, across the endothelial cell or between endothelial cells, through the interstitium into the regular cell. That interstitial layer is a very active layer. We now know it's made of multiple little tubules, little canaliculi. Think of fiber optics carrying electricity. It's those little fibers, and things travel along those fibers. So your hormones, your sugars, your substrates travel across that. But what also lives in that interstitial space, aside from the organs, is the organ structure. So the connective tissue of the organ. And in the larger structures of our limbs, we've got ligaments, tendons, and we've also got nerves that live in that area. So when the sugar level elevates in that interstitial area and is not cleared by the cells, when the cells are blocking the uptake of that sugar, inside that interstitium, you're also getting elevated sugar that damages nerves, that changes the cellular nature of the endothelial cells, and damages ligaments and tendons. That's why a lot of people with diabetes have ligament injuries to their shoulders. They can't comb their hair anymore. They get joint issues. They get all of the inflammation of their ligaments and tendons. But in the heart, those endothelial cells and the nerves within those that run under those endothelial cells become innervated. Instead of the cells just being endothelial cells, they become electrically activated. And now these collections of cells that are way off, think about having a house with a plug and then a meter up or 3 feet up from where the plug is, there's a source of electricity. When you lean against that wall, you're going to get a shock. And that's going to disrupt everything. It's not just gently like plugging a plug in. Same thing with the heart. And we call that arrhythmias. And one of the commonest bad arrhythmias that we're starting to see, which is electrical malfunction of the heart, also caused by elevated sugar, is called atrial fibrillation and various forms of irregular heartbeat. So we've got a plumbing problem, we've got a swelling problem, which is hypertension, and we've got, and I'm simplifying it, and then we've got an electrical problem or electrification of the cells, particularly at the pulmonary veins where they come into the heart. And so we have to go in and burn those to get rid of that electrical system. But those are the 3 cardiovascular diseases that are independently and collectively caused by elevated levels of sugar. And once you understand that, if I told you that this one thing was causing those 3 highly likely causes of your death, what's the obvious answer? Stay away from the harmful thing. You know, it's illogical not to be that simplistic, and yet it is that simple.
I think it is very, very simple. I'm just thinking of my father-in-law, who I spoke to yesterday. He's on 20 medications.
How old is your father-in-law? I know I don't want to throw him under the bus. How old is he?
78.
Okay.
At 78, 25% of his heart is blocked. And so when I said to him, talking about following a ketogenic or a carnivore diet, or at least low-carb diet, he's so deathly afraid of cholesterol. And we're going to talk about cholesterol and saturated fat. But the one thing that he's very scared of is to add salt, because he thinks that's worse for his heart. So as you said, this is very simple and very common. It makes sense. But a lot of people, especially those watching, might be just thinking, well, I've been told for decades that, you know, the opposite is true. I need to eat low fat. What would you say to those people?
Well, I think first of all, we've got to understand where the messaging is coming from. If you trust the tobacco companies, if you trust Kraft Foods, if you trust Nestle, if you trust Coca-Cola, I can't help you. Because that is their messaging, and it is marketing messaging. Just like one of the most trusted phrases that we use now is breakfast is the most important meal of the day, kickstart your metabolism with a healthy breakfast. Well, those were advertising slogans that came from a company called Kellogg's when they discovered Rice Krispies, and you can go back and Google that. So we have misinterpreted industry marketing certain things. So, for example, when it comes to sugar and salt, if you take a pile of sugar and a pile of salt and you put them in water, they both dissolve. In other words, what they're doing is they're holding on to water. That's how they dissolve. They attach themselves to water. Sodium chloride or glucose, and I already said glucose has 6 molecules of water attached to it. Sodium chloride, 1 each, okay? The human body has a very robust system of using sodium chloride, salt, to manage blood volume and blood fluid. Human beings are the only species that pee dilute urine. If you look at your dog, if you look at your cat, their urine is dark, but we've been told to drink 64 gallons of water a day, which is crazy. But part of the narrative of that is because the problem is not, hydration is not about water, it's about salt. Now, you don't want to drink sea salt, but at the same time, salt regulates our water distribution and our water retention and our water removal. And the human body has a great resource for dealing with salt. You pee it out, you sweat it out, and the largest resource of salt exchange is in the colon. We poop it out. So the body's equipped to handle excess salt. It does very, very poorly when you've got deficient salt. The body is so dependent on salt, it'll keep those salt numbers very close at the expense of getting rid of calcium, magnesium, and potassium. So if you're low salt, those other electrolytes are being peed out. Even though they're necessary, they're not as important as salt. Now, evolution, God and nature, whichever one you believe in, didn't just do that spontaneously or just because they had a little bit of a mind bend. Those things, that salt is vitally necessary to the function of the human body. Sugar, on the other hand, is toxic to the human body at elevated levels. And the human body has a very sophisticated system of clearing and getting rid of that sugar. The liver turns the sugar into fat. That's what's called a fatty liver. Fatty liver doesn't come from eating fat. It's the liver desperately trying to, it's the first place that we see sugar in the body is in the liver. So the liver is desperately trying to turn that into triglycerides. That's why the triglyceride numbers are so high. Body's trying to get rid of the sugar. Then the sugar gets taken up by the fat cells, and the fat cells turn into fat. I've already said that protects us. So the body's trying to protect us from excess sugar, but it is very tightly regulating salt. So salt is important, but sugar isn't. However, what industry has done very craftily is they've completely ignored sugar. So the worst situation is high levels of salt and high levels of sugar. But now each individual has to make a decision. Is the problem sugar or is the problem salt? And the narrative out there is that salt is the problem, not sugar. In exactly the same way in the 1950s, smoking's fine, nothing wrong with smoking. It's a great anxiolytic, said the tobacco companies. It's fine to smoke, but don't eat fat. We blamed fat in our diet for what nicotine was doing. Well, the human body doesn't need nicotine, but it needs fat. So what did we do? We went low fat, and for 20, 30 years, we continued to smoke. Just go to Europe and you'll see everybody's still smoking. So that is where it's a distorted narrative of reality, but it's industry-driven, not physiologically driven. And it's important to understand that. Look, I'm not going to argue with anybody and say, you must do this, you must do that. Just be logical about the way, put on your Mr. Spock hat and be logical about how the body works. We've been chasing salt forever. Salt mines, salt caravans. Salt was a very expensive thing. The Europeans only really discovered significant sources of sugar in the 1600s after Columbus discovered sugarcane, or brought sugar, didn't discover it, but brought sugarcane back from the Americas back to Europe. Prior to that, sugar was in honey, it was in some fruit, but it was a very rare commodity. Now we have this tsunami of sugar. I mean, if you think about it, the potato didn't exist in Ireland until about 1600. And now the Irish are, well, at least until recently, they were dependent on potatoes. So it's a very short duration of our existence that we've been high on the carbohydrates. So it's important to understand that when somebody says, oh, this is the problem, not this, you really want to step back from that and say, okay, how does my body work? What does it really need? Now, if you think about the human body, every single cell in your body is made up of 2 layers of fat. Okay, just structurally, forget about energy, 2 layers of fat. Every cell in your body, and your body's turning those cells over very rapidly. If you look at the brain, it looks like this white gelatinous material. Why? 65% of it is fat. Where does that fat come from? Some of it we make inside of our bodies, but there are certain structural fatty elements that we have to eat. And if you're on a low-fat diet, you're depriving your cells of healthy forms of fat. The way I look at fat consumption is, if you look at your car, if you're driving still a gasoline or a diesel car, you've got fuel in the gas tank, which is energy. And you've got oil in the engine, which is lubrication and is used for the structure and the function of the engine. They both come from fossil fuels, but they're very different. In exactly the same way with fat, some fat is very, very well used by the body as a source of energy. If you think about a bear hibernating, or the word ketosis is where you're using fat as a fuel source. But at the same time, all of our cells are made up of fat. We require fat for the structure, like the engine. And if you're taking gasoline and trying to make, and get the other form of gasoline would then be sugar. If you're trying to make structural oil from sugar, it doesn't work properly. So it's bad. I didn't say the analogy properly, but the point is that we need fat in our diet, not just as a fuel source, but also for the healthy structure of the human body. And that's important. And then the final important thing is, if you never, ever ate fat again in your life, you would die of certain essential fatty acid malnutrition. If you never, ever ate sugar again in your life, your liver is so good at making sugar that nothing bad would happen. And that's an important consideration. So sugar is not essential in the diet, fat is.
As you can hear from Dr. Cywes, we need fat and adequate protein, especially if we want to heal inflammation and heart disease. And a very easy way to do this is to try a carnivore diet, even for 90 days. Now, I've been doing a carnivore diet for the last 4 years, and I've noticed incredible benefits, not just in my physical health, but also in my mental health. But when I first started, my doctor was telling me, you're going to get a heart attack from eating all of that saturated fat and eating all of that fatty red meat. So I really didn't have any support at the beginning. And that's why I started a community, which has now grown to over 12,000 members. So if you're thinking about trying a carnivore diet, I would love to invite you to join our Go Carnivore community. Every week we have board certified carnivore and keto doctors to help support you and answer your most common medical questions, whether that be about blood pressure, kidney function, what's going to happen when I eat all of this protein and fat. We also have coaches, fat loss challenges, meal plans, and a list of over 800 carnivore and keto doctors. So if you'd like to join, just head to gocarnivore.com and you'll get a special discount on your first month. Let's talk about fat. Let's dive deep into fat. People know that they should be eating more healthy fats, have a heart healthy diet. They think of things like nuts, olive oil, different types of fats. Why is saturated fat so important? And does saturated fat in any way destroy the heart?
Well, okay, so let's go back a step because I think there's a misconception a little bit about saturated fat. The first thing is I don't like the word healthy, but I like to use the word natural and manufactured fat. Manufactured fat are the fats that are hydrolyzed and produced in factories. We have to heat seeds up. We have to extract fat. The fat that is what I call the natural fat is the fat that occurs naturally in animals, naturally in plants, or is just squeezed out of the plant like olive oil or coconut oil or avocado oil, where it's just pressed. I mean, all you're doing is you're squeezing it out of the fruit. So that's the category of natural fats which occur whether you eat an avocado or you squeeze it and you get the avocado oil. It's kind of the same thing. But if you squeeze a grape, you're not going to get the oil out. You have to heat it out. You have to hydrolyze it. It changes that is an unnatural characteristic of the fat. Grapeseed oil, canola oil. Crisco was developed as a engine lubricant many years ago. And really just gives us the liquid side. So I want to divide the fats into those two things: the naturally occurring fats and the unnaturally occurring fats. Now, what's interesting is everyone talks about saturated fats. That is an old historical term, and I'll tell you why. There is nothing that we eat, certainly on the animal product side, except for one thing that is dominant in saturated fat. And that's the only thing that is dominant in saturated fat is milk. And no mammal can survive without milk. Think that one through. So if milk was going to cause us harm, why does every child, every baby, whether you're a beluga whale, an elephant, or a human, we exist because of milk? Now we've manufactured something called a milkshake, which we feed our babies called formula. It's a milkshake. And yeah, we survive, but we don't do so very well. Our brains don't grow very well on those milkshake formulas. But milk is essential for human development, and it's saturated fat. So either God and nature are trying to kill us by giving us all the saturated fat in our milk, but there's a misnomer that saturated fat occurs as a dominant form of fat in any other form of meat. The commonest form of fat in any animal product is polyunsaturated fatty acids. So you got three major sources of fat. You've got and it's about the double bonds in the fat. There's a science behind it, but you've got your unsaturated fat or your monounsaturated fat. You've got your polyunsaturated fat with multiple double bonds, and then your saturated fat, which is all double bonds. And the kind of misconception is with the polyunsaturated fats. That's why I don't like to use those terms. I rather look at natural and unnatural or manufactured fats. That's how I divide it up. Because if you think about a steak's going to have all three components, with the dominant one, the fat in an animal, whether it's a salmon that you're eating, whether it is a skin that you're eating, whether it is a steak, whether it's bacon that you're eating, the fat in there is predominantly polyunsaturated. And polyunsaturated fat has received a bad name because it also occurs in the seed oils. But it's difficult to make that distinction. So I just like the word natural fat versus unnatural fat. And we as a species have been eating and chasing natural fat for our entire existence. I refer to the biblical side. It's just an easy reference. I'm not, I'm more an evolutionist than anything else, but they didn't slaughter the skinniest, leanest little goat or lamb or sheep in the Bible. It was the fattest one. And there was a reason for that. We fatten things up. If you go to Africa, the Maasai, when you're getting married or whatever it may be, they're giving you the hunter-gatherers, the fattest animal. They're always trying to fatten up the animal. And in fact, what we do, even here in the US, we bring cows and sheep and other animals into feedlots to fatten them up. And now you're telling us that's bad for us. It doesn't compute, if that makes sense. It doesn't compute. And if you think about it, if you look at two cows, you look at one cow, you look at, let's say, an Angus cow, and you look at a Jersey cow. They're both eating, let's say they're out in the range, they're both eating the same grass. Genetically, one cow, the Angus, turns it into meat and fat. Genetically, the Jersey cow turns it into milk. That's grass being turned into those two products, okay? But one is good for us, one is bad. The logic is just not there, let alone the science. So I think the division that I make in my own head is natural fat versus unnatural fat. Now, there are certain plants, beans, flax, that if you are vegetarian, either religiously or by your own beliefs, it doesn't bother me. But you want to be focused on the amount of fat you can get from your plant-based diet. I don't have a problem with that. But that is, again, where olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil enriches the fat content, or coconuts, avocados, and olives, if you eat them, enrich the fat in the vegetables. And if you are a green vegetarian who's focused on fat and protein, I have no issue with that. I know that in my own life, I'm carnivore based by preference, but I have no problem with people eating that way. But if you're eating a bunch of white manufactured food, ground up flour, the potatoes, the pastas, the rices, and you're not eating the other foods, it is a disease of malnutrition. And your carbohydrates are very high, and those foods are usually devoid of fat. On an animal-based diet, it's very easy to get the fat in. But what we've done in our society is we've cut all the fat out. So unfortunately, we have to add the fat back in. So if I'm eating a ribeye steak and it's got a big chunk of fat in, no problem. But if you're eating a chicken breast without the skin, you want to add some of that fat back because your body needs it.
Let's talk about diet, because people want to know what to eat. Now, as a double board certified surgeon, you follow a carnivore diet. Can you explain why you follow a carnivore diet?
It's very simple. It's got nothing to do with science. It's simpler and easier. And my dog doesn't eat leftover salad. So at home, it's a little bit beyond that. But the reality is nobody should start on a carnivore diet. It's too rigid. It's too strict. And the body can't go from this to this right away. You migrate toward it. And the way I look at diet is if you're an alcoholic, the only thing you should do is not drink alcohol. Nobody tells an alcoholic what they should drink. And as a human being, from a nutrition perspective, you want to stop thinking about everybody who's got a vested interest in telling you what's healthy for you and what's not healthy for you. But you just want to look broad spectrum at what foods are okay for me to eat and to understand yourself within that context. So what I like to do is to create a fairly rigid wall for somebody who's recovering from metabolic health. In other words, if you've been perfectly healthy, I have no problem with you having some potatoes or some rice every now and then. If you are like myself, I'll have a glass of wine every now and then. But if I was an alcoholic, I would stay away from it. So the context is important. Carbohydrates are not the problem. Carbohydrates are not the problem. Our relationship with them is. And that's so important to understand. However, our society has manufactured huge amounts of carbohydrates. And we've mixed those carbohydrates in with unnatural manufactured fat. And the danger is the manufactured food rather than the food that occurs naturally. Now, for myself, who has a relationship problem with carbohydrates, the problem is not carbohydrates. The problem is I can't stop. So therefore, I don't start. Very similar to an alcoholic. And it's important to take yourself into consideration. And certainly if you've got diabetes or you've been more than 20 kilos or 50 pounds heavier than the BMI of around 25, unless you're a big muscle-bound guy, your relationship with those carbohydrates is broken. So the first thing is look at your diet and get rid of the carbohydrates. But then within that, everything is fine. I don't care, as I said, if you're more vegetarian or more carnivore based. The rigid boundaries for me are staying away from the carbohydrates with the exception of vegetables, which are all carbohydrates. But nobody pigs out on Brussels sprouts. Within that, so those are my boundaries that I'm going to maintain for the rest of my life. The rigid boundary is no carbohydrates, no rice, no grains, no potatoes. I stay away from fruit because they're all manufactured or they're all hybridized and full of sugar. And in my life, while an apple may be okay for other people, for me, it's a trigger. So I've got to look at this not through the biology, but through the psychology. Does that make sense? So stay away from those. Now, if that's my boundary, within that, you can set yourself up anywhere. So those are the boundaries that you want to live within in my practice is all vegetables are fine to eat. All animal products are fine to eat. It then comes down to likability. Within that, you can then create for yourself a narrower spectrum of what we eat. And you start with a broader spectrum and slowly you refine that. If you're otherwise fairly healthy, you can then refine that as to what appeals to you the most. There's 1 billion people in India, of which a number of them are practicing Hindus who are vegetarian. Now, I'm not going to fight that. I'm going to work with them to have them be on a higher fat, more green vegetarian diet rather than a white vegetarian diet. There's certain disease like Crohn's disease, which is much better off of the anti-inflammatory side being pure carnivore. I've chosen to be carnivore or carnivore based because it's easier and simpler for me to exist that way. But if I eat vegetables, I have no problem with that. I'm just not going to be eating the rice, the potatoes, the ice creams. So the rigid boundary because the key thing here is not what you do for a little while, it's the sustainability. And if you're going to die at 100, you subtract your current age from 100, that's how long you want to stay in this realm. So I'm carnivore at home as a matter of convenience, and we don't have to throw vegetables out. If I go out to a restaurant and I feel like some asparagus, I'm going to eat it. Because I'd rather default to a vegetable than default to be so rigid that when I crash and burn, it's tubs of ice cream or bags of M&Ms. So, and I've got to understand myself as a human being. So within that realm, you can then set yourself up any way you choose to, but making sure that you are getting 3 essential things in. Number 1, fat. Number 2, salt. We've talked about both of those. And natural fat, salt. And then the third thing is making sure that you have a source of micronutrients. So in a carnivore diet, that's going to be eggs. And again, it's the likability. 2 of the 4 is fine. Eggs, dairy, organs, liver in particular, and then small fish and shellfish, sardines, oysters, clams, mussels, the whole animal. And that is those are the 4 areas where you get your micronutrients from, so you don't have to take a bunch of supplements. So I don't take any supplements except fish oil because I've got a history of dementia. But I also eat sardines, and probably the fish oil is excess. Same thing with olive oil. You eat olives regularly, you don't need the olive oil. But the olive oil is just a convenient way to get the fat in. So that's my personal diet. And I have that range. It's not a crime for me to eat a salad. It's not a crime for me to eat asparagus because they don't affect me. If I had Crohn's disease, if I had a lot of inflammatory disease, gut inflammatory disease from the vegetables, I'm going to be smart about it and not eat it. But it depends on each individual. The problem is the abundance, the tsunami abundance of manufactured carbohydrates. And those are the ones that have caused the health problems for most of us. So you've got to, and that's why I think you can, that's what healthcare has done, is create this algorithm box and they plug everybody into the same box. Okay. My wife doesn't have the same problems that I do. Okay. My son is being raised as a carnivore. He's 3 years old. Okay. Eventually he'll be exposed to other things, but if his foundation is what he's currently eating, then those other things don't matter that much. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I think that depending on who you speak to and their perspective, a lot of people are quite confused about what to eat because everything sounds bad. But I think that from your perspective, it's very, very simple. Avoid the sugars, avoid the manufactured fats, focus on natural fats.
Now, let me stop you for a second there. The first thing you want to do is get to know who you are. Be honest with yourself and know who you are. I know I don't have control of that relationship. And therefore, I have chosen, I can eat ice cream anytime I want to. I have chosen not to. It's an integrity-based decision. If you feel deprived of something, it's just a question of time before you do. You know, I call myself a carb addiction doc, and as much, I look at sugar and starch not as a food source, because we don't need it. I look at it as a drug that we become dependent on. And there are people that use alcohol, there are people that abuse alcohol, there are alcoholics. But alcohol is not necessary for survival. I look at carbohydrates in exactly the same way. Okay. And then the flip side is making sure that you are getting adequate, healthy food in to your system. And we're going to talk about fat now. But I think the key thing here is get to know who you are as an individual and be honest with yourself.
Absolutely. Myself as well. I cannot handle carbohydrates. If I have a little bit of sugar, it's a roller coaster and I cannot stop. So that's why fat for me and fat for you and fat for many people is very satiating. It's very good for your hormones, very good for your brain, very good for your heart. Let's talk about if somebody wants to switch to this kind of way of eating. They need to eat more fat initially. Why is that so important?
Well, I think the first thing is that when you look at the three macronutrients, you've got fat, you've got protein, and you've got carbohydrates. It's that simple. Those are the three sources of energy. Protein, no matter whether you're vegan or carnivore, is actually fairly stable. And too little protein is a problem if you're vegan. But if you're not vegan or pure vegetarian, protein is never an issue. And I said that. But the narrative in our community is protein, protein, protein. And that's an error because the liver will take excess protein and turn it into sugar. There is no store in the human body for protein. So the narrative should not be protein, protein, protein. In the modern era, it should be fat, fat, fat. And the body will regulate fat consumption. It doesn't regulate lean protein consumption. So that's an important consideration. And so really what you're trying to do as you shift is you're trying to replace the average obese person, the average diabetic person is eating 80 to 90% of their calories as sugar, with less than 5 or 10% as fat, and the remainder making up 15% or so of protein. So you can do that math. It's kind of how it works out. So really what you're slowly trying to do, you're not trying to do it like this. It's not a diet that you start tomorrow and you go all in. You slowly exchange the carbohydrates in your diets for fat. And it's a slow, steady exchange of the two. So really what you're trying to do, the protein, the fat, and the sugar really drive the hormones that control our nutrition. And if you look at the way the human body works, there are three phases that form the healthiest human body in terms of function. And the hormones, they're all interrelated, whether it's estrogen, whether it's vitamin D3, which is a hormone, whether it is insulin or glucagon, all those hormones are interrelated. Adrenaline, they're all interrelated. So they all influence each other. Thyroid hormones, all of those. So the substrates, the protein, fat, and sugar regulate your hormonal environment. And human beings are very tidal. So when you're eating, it's not just what you're eating, it's the timing of your eating, and the snacking is also an issue. So the first thing is when you eat, if you're eating high carbohydrate and some protein, all of that load is going up from the gut, up the portal vein to the liver, and the liver then has to be in storage and distribution mode. So the liver is creating energy, manufacturing energy under the influence of insulin, T3, thyroid hormone, human growth hormone, and testosterone, even in females. And the liver is now a net producer of energy. And if the liver is tasked with too much, it begins to fail. It's got a limited capacity. So now you're starting to get fatty liver, the sugar is spilling over into your blood vessels, you're taking it up as fat, or it's elevating the blood sugar. So when the liver is in storage mode, if you overwhelm it, either with a massive amount or repetitively by multiple meals or multiple snacks, the liver cannot function normally, it can't protect you. But the first stage is storage. Then when you've stored what you've eaten and you're going a fairly decent amount of time without eating, so at first the liver is sending food out for storage. It's sending sugar to the muscles to be stored as glycogen. It's sending sugar to the fat cells. It's sending out a little bit of fat to be stored as fat, triglycerides. Some of the fat that you're eating, we'll talk about this in a second, bypasses the liver. Come to that in a second. But there's a lot of pressure on the liver, and if you're eating excess protein, it has to convert that to sugar and then to fat. Once you've stored your meal, now your insulin, your thyroid hormone, your testosterone hormones, they go down. But they go down, and the hormone that starts to come up is glucagon. And glucagon, I call your utilization hormone. And so now what happens in this, instead of the cells being net recipients of energy, they're now facing a slight energy deficit. So they're saying, hey, I need energy. And the liver then becomes part of the distribution center, creating and sending that energy out to the to the cells under the influence of glucagon. The first stage with glucagon is to release the stored sugar, and the liver will always store sugar first. As glycogen in the liver, you send that out to the cells, here's a bit of sugar, but there's a very small capacity, about 400 to 600 grams of storage of sugar by the liver. Once that's gone, once you've used that up, now your cells are still saying, dude, I need energy. And if you're eating repetitively, you never get out of glucose utilization. Okay? But the cells depend, the healthiest cells depend on the third phase. And if you go a decent amount of time without eating, that's where Jason Fung's intermittent fasting comes in. Now the liver is saying, look, I've got no energy, I need energy. And that's where, under the influence of glucagon, you mobilize fat from your fat cells. The fat comes back to your liver. Your liver releases it fatty acids as well as ketones. The liver manufactures ketones under the influence of glucagon. Now, we talked earlier about LDL, and LDL got a bad name. Well, when you're in fat utilization, the majority of the way in which fat is transported from your fat cells back to the liver and to other cells is in a molecule called LDL. It is vitally necessary for the healthiest way of life. It only patches damage to blood vessels if you're high on sugar, and the LDL is these small little fat deficit or triglyceride poor molecules. But the healthy LDL, and it can be a high number, is filled with triglycerides, is very healthy fat traveling in the blood vessels. And it's just a transport molecule bringing fat from your fat cells back to the liver for ketone manufacture and out to the cells as an energy source. And that is the healthiest state of being. It's called the fat utilization phase, governed by a low level of insulin sensitive, as well as a higher level of of glucagon. And that is the healthiest state of being. That's where your tissues are being repaired. You're getting cellular divisions happening. Cancer surveillance is happening. All of those healthy states of being are happening during fat utilization. And the best measure of fat utilization phase is a high HDL. High HDL, and LDL can be high, but it's big fluffy molecules of LDL. So the LDL size should be high. Your VLDL should be low, because VLDL is the molecule that transports fat from the liver to the fat cells. Remember here, the liver is a recipient of energy from the fat cells. So that's the healthiest state of being. So we can look at low VLDL numbers, high LDL with fat-rich LDL, high cholesterol, high HDL as being the healthiest state of being, because that is where the body is healing itself. That is the ideal state to be in. And consumption of food should only be rare and occasional, and should be the food that your body mostly needs. The sugar can be manufactured. The liver does that. It can make it from protein. It can make it from glycerol. It doesn't need to produce that. So that third phase, that fat utilization phase, is the healthiest state to be in, and that's where you're using fat. And that's why fat transport is such an important thing. And if you block it with a statin, now you're depriving your cells of energy. So what do? You get hungry, so you eat again. And you're eating a lot of sugar. So at first, when your entire system, when you've been eating a lot of carbohydrates for a long time, and you've got diabetes, you're overweight, or you've got cardiovascular disease, whatever those may be, from the metabolic dysfunction of carbohydrates, you want to slowly, you can't do it rapidly, you want to slowly convert your body to being a primary sugar burner, to being a primary fat burner. Well, if you're going to do that, you want to feed your body that fat, and you want to use fat to diminish carbohydrates. And the reason for that is important, because if you're insulin resistant, even if you go a long time without eating, your insulin levels still stay very high. They don't just come right down. That doesn't happen in a day or two. So if your insulin levels are high, it's blocking utilization of your own fat. So you want to be eating fat in your diet so it's available to you. Now, the saturated fat, or the long chain fats, the polyunsaturated saturated fats, bypass the liver. They go straight to the fat cells, and under the influence of insulin, they get taken up by the fat cells, but they also get taken up by the general cells. So you're slowly converting your cells under the hormonal changing environment to changing from being dominantly sugar burners to being fat burners. And the cells really don't care for the most part. Most cells can use both. Some prefer one or the other. However, the cells don't care if it's glucose or fat that they're burning. It's the hormonal system that regulates health or unhealth. And what people don't understand is that someone like me who's obesogenic, my diseases, when I ate a lot of sugar, didn't come from sugar. They came from chronically elevated levels of insulin. So cancer is a disease that is common in my genetic pattern, the obesogenic pattern, because insulin regulates cancer transformation. So the Angelina Jolie breast genes, the BRCA and the HER2, those are regulated by insulin. Yes, those are genetic diseases, but yeah, they've been there for thousands of years. We've just suddenly started seeing breast cancer rates increase rapidly. Why? Because insulin prevents the regulation of the stopping of that cell division. Now you got cancer. It's an insulin problem, not a BRCA or HER2 gene problem. So Alzheimer's is another one. Insulin regulates the sugar in the brain, and you want fat in the brain, not sugar. A little bit of sugar, but mostly fat. So all of those, so obesogenic people like myself, we're at risk for heart disease, not for heart disease, for cancer, for Alzheimer's. In women, it's polycystic ovarian syndrome, because now you're getting higher testosterone, lower estrogen. That's regulated by insulin. So if your insulin levels are high, that's a problem. Men, it's low testosterone, autoimmune disease, thyroid disease, that kind of thing, all regulated by insulin. And that is in the obesogenic people who produce a lot of insulin. The diabesogenic people who cannot produce a lot of insulin, their damage is being caused by chronically elevated levels of sugar, because they don't have enough insulin to clear that sugar. They're getting the cardiovascular disease, the stroke disease, the neuropathy, and it's a different disease spectrum. Obviously, it's a bell curve. So either way, for both populations, in my case, you want to bring my insulin levels down by not triggering it with carbohydrates. In the diabetic situation, they want to bring their blood sugar levels down. It doesn't happen instantly. That conversion takes about 2 years to occur. But the question then is, how long are you going to do this for? You take your age, you subtract it from 100 if you're going to die at 100. That's how long you want to do it for. So 2 years is a very small component, but don't expect to see massive results in a week. Body doesn't work that way. You may lose a little bit of weight, but the hormonal regulation doesn't change in a week. You know, the analogy I use in this regard is if you take your gasoline car and you go to the gas station, are you petrol or gas? Which one do you use?
Petrol.
Petrol, yeah. So if you go to the petrol station and you put petrol in your car and you say, oh my God, the price is too high, I'm going to put diesel in my car. The engine blows up. So if you suddenly go from fueling your body with sugar with fat, your body's going to reject that. It's miserable. But if you rebuild the engine to tolerate the diesel slowly over time, and that's the key thing, this is not a nutrition problem, a diet that you can lose 10 pounds in 2 days. That's what all diets pitch, because success is measured by weight loss. It doesn't work that way. This is a reformatting of the foundation of your body, both psychologically as well as biologically. This is changing the hormonal state of the human body by using these substrates to change it. And it takes time to heal the body. It doesn't happen. You see things happen fairly rapidly within the first few weeks, but the long-term changes take years to occur, where you are no longer insulin resistant. And so it's a slow, steady thing. You want to be the tortoise, not the rabbit.
Let's talk about statins, because when people follow a higher fat diet, doesn't matter if it's carnivore, ketogenic, whatever the diet is, low carb, whatever, they're going to look at their blood work. Their LDL cholesterol may increase, not for all people. Their total cholesterol is going to increase. And most likely the doctor is going to put them or recommend a statin. A lot of people on statins. Can you talk about how the risks of statins and how they are negligible in preventing heart disease and heart attacks for certain populations?
Right. So the first thing that you want to understand is, and I understand the obsession with statins, because if heart disease, if heart attacks and strokes are the commonest cause of death, doctors should be appropriately worried about your heart attack and stroke risk. The problem is that what they do is they associate elevated LDL, elevated cholesterol with that risk, and that's a false association. That association does not exist. Okay, so that's the first thing. So we've been misconstrued with that. What really matters is, what is your personal risk of a heart attack or a stroke? And I said at the beginning of this discussion, there's a very simple test, a screening test that we can get for that. And the screening test is called a CAC, a coronary artery calcium score. And I start to get CAC scores. It's a simple CT scan, very low radiation, very low risk. I get a CAC score starting at the age of 40, and it's probably warranted to get that even younger. But at least at 40, you're looking for plaque in the blood vessels. And that'll help you to determine, am I at risk or am I not at risk? And so if you've got plaque in your blood vessels, you are then on the more diabesogenic side, or you're a smoker. Forget about the smokers for a second. We're talking about the carbohydrates. So you are at risk for a heart attack or a stroke. Then the question is, do we treat the fire trucks or the fire? Are we treating the inflammation or the healing process? And The reality is what we want is a flexible healing process, because all of us are damaging our blood vessels all the time. You want to have a little clot that forms, a fibrin clot that forms, that at least plugs the hole. Think of it this way. If you cut yourself and you form a scab, that's healthy. But if you then form a keloid, you know what a keloid is, that hypertrophic scar, that's not a good thing. That's an overreaction by the body. Same thing when it comes to the cholesterol. And so what you want to do is you want to have the healing, but you don't want to have the excess keloid. Now, in a keloid, it's made of fibroblasts. You don't want to get rid of the fibroblasts. That's silly, because your body needs that all the time, just like your body needs cholesterol all the time. What you want to do is to interrupt the massive increase and the overburden of the cholesterol, of the fat and the cholesterol that's sticking to it. And the way you do that is you allow the fibrin clot to work, but you interrupt the cellular immune system. You interrupt the platelets and you interrupt the white cells before you even get to the cholesterol plaque, because the cholesterol plaque's permanent. You want a small clot, but you don't want that clot just to remain there and not be dissolved. And so getting rid of the cholesterol is not only not really fixing the problem, it's also harming you from the other benefits of that cholesterol, of that LDL molecule. And your brain in particular needs that. You know, the statins cross into the brain. The brain is about 2% of the human body, and yet it uses 20% of the body's cholesterol. Well, if you block that, how's your brain supposed to work? How's your brain supposed to repair itself? So that is a big concern. And if you block the pathway with a single enzyme that creates cholesterol is necessary in all of your cells. The statins also secondarily affect diabetes, 7 to 11% increased risk of diabetes. Commonest problem with statins is muscle pain, muscle wasting, even to the point of rhabdomyolysis. They've even got a name for it, okay? Statin-induced muscle atrophy, SEMA, okay? So if you've named the side effect, that's a problem. Now they've got drugs to treat the side effects of statins. Your CoQ10 levels go down. That's a vital molecule. Statins block that. So the harm of statins is about 42% of people are going to have significant clinical harm from statins, and there is no benefit because the reduction of plaque doesn't affect that big clot from forming. You want to interrupt the clot at the time where it crosses over from being dissolvable to being permanent. And that is at the platelet and the white cell level. And the two drugs that most effectively treat that are aspirin, which blocks platelet activation, and a new drug just in the US, just recently covered by FDA, is a drug called colchicine. We typically use it for gout, but colchicine blocks the activation of white cells. And low-dose colchicine is about 20 times better as a treatment than statins, without all the significant side effects, especially if it's a low dose. So you want to interrupt the cascade of clotting, but you don't want to do it at that final level because of all the other damage that you're doing.
You also said that GLP-1s like Ozempic could also be a better treatment, more for insulin resistance. And you also said that statins in 10 to 20 years will become largely obsolete by cardiologists.
Correct. And the reason for that is because the problem here, let's take smoking out of the equation again, is insulin resistance, that we just talked about. And whether that's on the obesogenic side or the diabesogenic side, the GLP-1s and that class of drugs, the GIPs, there's a new drug, glucagon agonist, receptor antagonist called GGG that Eli Lilly is just about to produce or is in trials right now that it's available elsewhere. Those are drugs that directly address the problem of sugar. So while the aspirin, the colchicine help with the plaque itself far better than the statins, the key thing to understand is that preventing this disease with a healthy diet, we cause the problem. We can reverse it or we can stop it by changing our diet. But there are some people who need help to accelerate that. If you're at imminent risk of a heart attack, that's a problem. So for example, if you take someone with high blood pressure, changing their diet is going to bring that blood pressure down to the point that they can come off their medication. But you're not going to say, don't take medication, because you don't want something bad to happen while they're getting better. You want to throw everything at them and then deprescribe as they get healthier. You don't want to say, oh, no, it's not, we're not going to give you anything. Same thing here with the clotting. You want to be on that medication for a while until your own risk is gone. And we can measure that with insulin by measuring insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity. However, the GLP-1s accelerate that. So if you're 15 years old and you've got a little bit of plaque in your blood vessels, yes, we see that. I'm not going to put that person on a GLP-1. I'm going to work very hard with them to change their eating pattern. Okay. However, if you're 60 years old and you've had a heart attack, we're going to accelerate that by using these medications. And they're very effective. They're a first-line drug for hypertension. They're a first-line drug for diabetes, maybe a second-line drug for both of those. And certainly for the plaque disease, they stabilize and significantly improve that. And there have been several studies now that have proven that they are better than statins in that regard.
You're the carb addiction doc. And you mentioned earlier about carb addiction, and not many people talk about this as changing your relationship to food, not following a diet or a label. Can you just elaborate more about that and why that is so important?
Right. So most people, the majority of people that start a diet or change their diet, it's because of a negative consequence. They want to lose some weight, they've got diabetes, they've got heart disease, they've got hypertension. There's a reason why they want to change. There are some people out there that are focused on their diet that have no health issues, significant health issues, just want to be healthier by eating correct. That's not the population I'm talking about, but the overwhelming number of us are going to get sick and die of metabolic disease caused by our diet. We're very good at beating infections and all the other things. Car wrecks and metabolic problems are the commonest cause of death right now. So if you're in a state where harm has happened, by definition, if you've had 5 DUIs, driving under intoxication, and you've got liver disease, you no longer have control over alcohol. Nobody just uses a little bit of heroin on a Tuesday morning. We've got to recognize the concept that we have shifted as a society, but as individuals, away from primarily eating food for its nutritional value toward primarily eating and drinking, snacking and eating and drinking and carbohydrates for our emotional management system. And the secondary effect is maybe it keeps us alive, but not very well. And all the harm is related to that. So it is never the carbohydrates, as I said, that are the problem. It's our relationship with them. And that's where, as an individual, we have to recognize that. If you're sneaking off and eating stuff, if you're snacking, a snack is always an emotional event. It is never a nutritional event. If you're hoarding those carbohydrates, if you have them freely available to you, you want to look at that relationship and look at the harm that it's done. And it's really, really difficult for the alcoholic to recognize they have a problem. That ownership is the first step. Then you make a choice. I can eat, as I said, I can eat carbohydrates anytime I want to. I've chosen my health over my enjoyment of carbohydrates. And that's a personal choice. I don't have to. We're all going to die. I can tell you don't text while you're driving, but you make a decision every time and it can rapidly shorten your life. Well, same thing here. We're all going to die. But how we get there is our choice. So I'm not going to say you must or you have to. If you choose, I can help you, but I cannot make that choice for you. However, I can also provide information, as I've tried to do through this discussion, to alter the distorted narrative out there. For example, Coca-Cola says, oh, you need our sugar. You're just fat and diabetic because you don't exercise. And they invested billions of dollars in Move More. That's why everybody's so obsessed with exercise. And yet, we think that we have to fuel ourselves with carbohydrates, carb loading, and all that kind of thing for exercise. Well, if you smoke 3 cigarettes, no matter how much you exercise, you're not going to breathe it out. But yes, you can burn off the carb. No, they're toxic at ingestion. And so we've got to undo the distortion of that reality by industry. And once we get back to the basic way in which the human body works and the human body's needs, what we need mentally is an effort-based emotion management system. Going for a walk, having some spirituality if you choose to, meditation, having some quiet time, having human connection as a way to offload emotional tension. Most of us really don't have a healthy relationship where we can trust somebody and be vulnerable within that space. Think that one through. We live in an unprecedented 8 billion people on the planet Earth, and everybody's lonely. Everybody's alone. So establishing healthy human connections, establishing creative outlets, establishing, as I said, physically active outlets for our emotional needs. But what do? We eat crap and we spend time on screens. And more we're using instant gratification as a way to manage emotional need, rather than an effort-based system. We have to put effort and time into chilling out and relaxing. And so as much as we focused on metabolic health, the overwhelming issue in our society right now is mental dysfunction, emotion management dysfunction. And yet the least resources at schools, in our community, in every way, shape, or form, is spent on healthy ways of offsetting against emotional tension, which is quintessential to human beings. You see, I'm talking a lot with my hands. That's an anxiolytic for me, but it's not a harmful one. So if we look at the mental health component, carbohydrates are just a phase, like alcohol was in the US pre-prohibition. Then it became nicotine. Now it's carbohydrates with a mixture of some of the opioid drugs. But these are all dysfunctional forms of emotion management. And as a society, more and more of us are burdened with that.
Dr. Cywes, thank you so much for your time. I know that we ran a little bit over. If people love you or want to hear from you more, how can they find you?
Well, the best place is I've got a little YouTube channel called Carb Addiction Doc. I go into some of the science. I go into some of the behavior. They're old videos on there. It's the best way to educate yourself. And that's why I do these types of videos, just to get some of the counterpoint out there. If I do consults, I'm a clinically practicing doctor. You've said I'm a surgeon. Yes, that's my degree background. I still do surgery, but I consider myself to be a metabolic health practitioner. We can look at blood work. We can analyze where you are. We can give you guidance, but you've got to look for us. And there is a phone number at the bottom of our YouTube channel. It's and can be done by WhatsApp, 561-517-0642, anywhere in the world. And we can call up and do a consult either by Zoom, by WhatsApp, or by telephone. The final thing I'll tell you, Rena, is I don't care if you agree or disagree with me. If I've made you think for yourself, I've done my job.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode with Dr. Rob Cywes. You can find the full show notes, including reference articles, journals, books, and studies on the 5MB Labs. There is a link in the description of this video. If you are learning from and enjoying these episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support our mission of root cause healing. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm at 5Minute Body on Instagram and on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I generally share different information to what you'll find here on YouTube. I share health advice and tips that I learned from the best experts and doctors. And if you'd like to leave a comment or you have a recommendation of a guest speaker, please leave that in the YouTube comments, as I check every single one. Now, if you love this episode with Dr. Cywes, you will also enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Philip Ovadia. Dr. Ovadia is a 20-year cardiac heart surgeon, and he'll talk about the true cause of heart disease, the role of ketosis, and how that actually helps your heart. We also talk about the 5 metabolic markers that every person needs to know to understand their risk of heart disease. And we also talk about foods, what to eat, and also some healthy foods that we're eating every day that's actually accelerating the risk of heart disease. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.